Each of us swears fidelity and love when we get married. But what happens when those promises are broken? When the trust built over years is shattered by one act? Sometimes you have to go through the chaos of coming face to face with betrayal to realize the depth of the pain. My name is Jonathan Miller. I am a man who believed in the idea of love and family. My wife Emily and I were together for almost 10 years. I thought I knew her like I knew myself. But one day, everything changed. The truth stabbed into my life like a knife. And now, looking back, I realized that the night I learned her secret was the beginning of the most dramatic phase of my life. This is a story of betrayal, revenge, and finding yourself amidst the wreckage of a broken family. Our marriage to Emily seemed perfect to those around us. We hosted dinners for friends, went on vacations, and regularly posted happy pictures on social media. But behind the facade of perfect living was a crack that I started to notice a few months ago. At first it was the little things, her unexpected work meetings, the rare delays at work that became more frequent, and the sudden bursts of irritation when I asked simple questions. But one day, things became clearer. I found her phone on the kitchen table while she was in the shower. The screen lit up with a new message, and I couldn't help myself. It was from an unknown number. I can't stop thinking about our night. When will I see you again? It felt like the ground had gone from under my feet. I couldn't believe it was written for her. My chest clenched with pain mixed with anger. When Emily stepped out of the shower, I already knew I wouldn't be able to look at her like I had before. At first, I was at a loss. What to do? Ask her outright? Walk away without giving her a chance to explain herself? Or should I just bear it? But then an idea popped into my head. If she betrayed me, I wanted her to feel the same pain. I began to proceed carefully. I found her lover's number through messages. His name was Mark. I started gathering information. It turned out that Mark was married. His wife, Rachel, didn't suspect a thing. And that's when my plan was born. If Emily was willing to betray our family, I was going to shatter her illusion of a perfect life. A couple weeks later, I organized a party at our house. Emily was thrilled. She always loved being the center of attention. She had no idea that I had invited Rachel. After I came across the message, everything inside me turned upside down. But instead of rushing in with accusations, I decided to take a pause to consider my actions. At times like this, anger can blind you, and I didn't want to do something I'd regret later. Emily didn't notice anything. She was still so caring and smiling, though her smile seemed fake to me now. She continued to act like our life was perfect. But every move she made, every look she gave me doubts. I began to listen to her words, noticing the smallest details that had previously escaped my attention. Every word cut like a knife. "I'll be late at work, we have an important meeting," she said one evening. "Of course, darling," I replied, barely concealing the bitterness in my voice. These work meetings began to happen all too often. But I knew that if I started asking questions, she'd just shirk. Emily had always been a master of persuasion, and I was afraid she might convince me that I was making it all up. One weekend we went on a picnic with friends. Emily was in her repertoire, jokes, laughter, a charming smile that could melt ice. I watched her from the sidelines, trying to figure out if she'd always been such a good actress or if she'd just now learned how to fake it. "Are you okay?" my best friend Michael asked, noticing that I was getting pensive. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied. I couldn't tell anyone about my suspicions. It seemed that by voicing them, I was admitting my weakness, admitting that my life was a sham. Emily leaned toward me and whispered, "I'm so glad we were able to get out in nature. It helps me relax so much." Her words sounded sincere, but I didn't believe a word she said anymore. I started checking her out slowly and cautiously. Installed an app on her phone to see messages and calls. I never thought I would get to this point, but betrayal turns a person into someone they never wanted to be. I noticed that she started going out more often with her friend Laura. It was her favorite alibi, but I knew Laura was too carefree to cover for her for long. I met Laura by chance at the supermarket. Emily didn't notice anything. She was still so caring and smiling, though her smile seemed fake to me now. She continued to act like our life was perfect. But every move she made, every look she gave me doubts. I began to listen to her words, noticing the smallest details that had previously escaped my attention, every word cut like a knife. "I'll be late at work, we have an important meeting," she said one evening. "Of course, darling," I replied, barely concealing the bitterness in my voice. These work meetings began to happen all too often. But I knew that if I started asking questions, she'd just shirk. Emily had always been a master of persuasion, and I was afraid she might convince me that I was making it all up. One weekend we went on a picnic with friends. Emily was in her repertoire: jokes, laughter, a charming smile that could melt ice. I watched her from the sidelines, trying to figure out if she'd always been such a good actress or if she'd just now learned how to fake it. "Are you okay?" my best friend Michael asked, noticing that I was getting pensive. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied. I couldn't tell anyone about my suspicions. It seemed that by voicing them, I was admitting my weakness, admitting that my life was a sham. Emily leaned toward me and whispered, "I'm so glad we were able to get out in nature. It helps me relax so much." Her words sounded sincere, but I didn't believe a word she said anymore. I started checking her out slowly and cautiously. Installed an app on her phone to see messages and calls. I never thought I would get to this point, but betrayal turns a person into someone they never wanted to be. I noticed that she started going out more often with her friend Laura. It was her favorite alibi, but I knew Laura was too carefree to cover for her for long. I met Laura by chance at the supermarket. "Hi, Jonathan. How are you doing?" she said, smiling. "Fine. How are your meetings with Emily going? You must be spending a lot of time together." I asked with a slight chuckle. Her face changed for a moment, and I realized she wasn't aware of the meetings. "Oh, we haven't seen each other in a while." "I think she's busy with work," Laura replied uncertainly. It was another nail in the coffin of trust. The more I dug, the more I noticed little things I had previously ignored. Emily began to scrutinize her appearance. New dresses, expensive perfume, morning jogs that she'd never been interested in before. "I want to get in shape," she said one day. "Is that a bad thing?" "No, it's not bad. But when you know that your wife has a lover, such changes are perceived differently." Every day I felt rage building up inside me. I tried to suppress it, but it was impossible. All I could do was wait for the right moment. The idea for the party came to me out of the blue. Emily had always loved organizing events, gathering friends and family, showing off what a perfect life we had. I decided to turn it into her own personal hell. "Why don't we have a party?" I suggested it over dinner. "You did? Do you want to?" Emily was surprised. I rarely took the initiative in these things. "Yeah, I think it would be fun. It's been a long time since we've gotten everyone together." She smiled, and I saw genuine joy in her eyes. But in my head I was already constructing a scenario of how it would all end. The days leading up to the party passed in a flurry. Emily was in her element, decorating the house, ordering food, making the guest list. She seemed happy, engrossed in the process, and it confused me again. Is it possible that I was wrong? Could it be that this message I saw was a misunderstanding? She was acting so naturally, but as soon as I thought about it, my memory brought me back to her strange behaviors, the way she disappeared so often, the way her phone was always with her, even when she was asleep. No, I couldn't be wrong. I, too, set about making preparations, my own, invisible to her. After days of observing and analyzing, I already knew that Rachel, Mark's wife, had to be at this party. But I couldn't just call her and tell her everything directly. That would be too easy, and I wanted everything to come out perfectly. The evening the day before the party, Emily sat on the couch with a glass of wine, satisfied. "I think it's going to be perfect. We need more events like this," she said. Smiling, "I agree," I replied briefly, trying not to give away my aloofness. She reached up and touched my shoulder with her hand gently. "Are you okay? You've been kind of quiet lately." just a lot of work, I replied with a slight smile. Inside, I was seething. Her touch, which used to bring me calmness, now brought only irritation. How could she be so sure that I knew nothing? The next day, while Emily was busy shopping, I decided to make the first move. I found Rachel's number on Mark's social media accounts and sent her a message. Hello Rachel. My name is Jonathan. I need to talk to you. It's regarding your husband. Please call me when you have time. I didn't know how she would react. But I hoped she would be alerted by the mere fact that I had reached out to her. A couple hours later, my phone rang. It's Rachel. The voice on the other end of the line sounded calm but wary. Thank you for calling me back. I want you to know that your husband Mark and my wife Emily have been meeting behind our backs for some time now. There was silence on the other end. Then I heard a soft breath. Are you sure? Her voice shook. More than sure. And I want you to know that we're having a party tomorrow. I'd like you to come. She didn't answer right away. Apparently she needed to process what she'd heard. I'll be there. I'll be there. The day of the party, Emily was especially animated. She was running around the house, making sure everything was perfect. I watched her from the sidelines, trying not to show my tension. As the guests began to gather, I noticed the way she looked at everyone who entered, as if waiting for something. Was she really hoping Mark would come? I met Rachel at the door. She looked shaken but collected. Thank you for coming, I said, gesturing for her to come in. She nodded and walked inside. Emily, busy talking to her friend, didn't even notice her arrival. Rachel's demeanor was restrained. She didn't approach Emily right away, watching her from a distance. I introduced her to a few of the other guests so no one would suspect why she was here. As the evening reached its peak, I decided it was time to begin. Friends, I said, raising my glass. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm glad to see so many close people here. Emily, who was standing next to me, smiled as she looked at the guests. She was obviously pleased with the way things were going, but today I'd like to say something special. About how sometimes the people closest to us can surprise us. There was a flicker of concern in her eyes. She didn't know where I was going with this, but she was beginning to suspect something. The party went on, the guests were having fun, and the atmosphere was relaxed. Emily was glowing. She always liked to be the center of attention. I, on the other hand, had been holding in a storm of emotion the whole time, but outwardly I remained calm. Rachel, meanwhile, kept to herself. She was watching Emily, as if she were about to assess her every word, every gesture. I knew the moment was coming, but I had to approach it carefully. When everyone was gathered in the living room, I approached Emily and proposed a toast. She happily agreed. Sure. I'm always up for a few words. She stood in the middle of the room, smiling, and raised her glass. Friends, I want to thank each of you for being here today. Jonathan and I are very blessed to have such wonderful friends and family. Her words sounded so sincere that many of the guests began to applaud. But her words only made me angry. I knew that behind that sincerity was a lie. When she finished, I raised my glass and stood next to her. Thank you, Emily. Those are beautiful words. And I'd like to add something of my own. The guests fell silent, their eyes on me. Emily was a little tense, but still trying to look at ease. I'd like to tell a story today, I began. A story about trust, love, and betrayal. Emily smiled, but her smile was getting strained. She was beginning to realize that something was going wrong. Sometimes the people we trust the most turn out to be the ones who hurt us, I continued, looking directly at her. And sometimes, someone else comes into their life and becomes more important. There was a heavy silence in the room. The guests began to glance around. Emily blushed, but was still trying to keep her face straight. What are you talking about, Jonathan? She asked nervously. I smiled. You know what I'm talking about. I looked at Rachel, who was still silent. Rachel, would you like to say something? Emily turned to her, a mixture of shock and panic in her eyes. Rachel. Are you in here? Rachel took a step forward, her face impassive. Yes, I'm here, Emily. And I'm here because Jonathan told me what's going on. Emily turned pale. I don't know what you mean. You know exactly what you mean, I interrupted her. Did you think this was going to be a secret? The guests froze. Some of them tried to defuse the tension with jokes, but most of them just stared at us in bewilderment. I pulled out my phone and opened Emily's correspondence with Mark. Want to know what the perfect wife looks like? Here are a few of her messages. I've never felt as alive as I do with you, I read aloud. Or this one, Jonathan will never know. He's too trusting. Emily tried to snatch the phone out of my hands, but I took a step back. It's a lie. She screamed. You got it all wrong, but no one believed her now. Even her closest friends looked at her with disbelief. Emily stood in the middle of the living room, her face contorted with a mixture of rage and despair. The guests who had been laughing and cheering her on a moment ago were now looking at her with surprise and judgment. I took a deep breath to keep myself from screaming. Everything I'd been feeling for the past few months was now spilling out. You think I hadn't noticed? You think I haven't seen you hiding your phone, your work delays becoming more frequent? My voice sounded cold but torn with emotion. You not only destroyed our marriage, but the trust one had in you. Emily rushed to me, her hands trembling. John, please. I can explain everything. It was a mistake. Just one mistake. Her voice grew quieter and quieter, but I couldn't listen to her anymore. A mistake. It's not a mistake, Emily. It's a choice. And you made it. There was dead silence in the room. The guests began to disperse, apologizing for witnessing such a spectacle. Some tried to comfort Emily, but she just waved her hand, turning away from them. Rachel came over to me and said quietly, You did the right thing. Thank you for telling me the truth. I nodded at her, but I felt empty inside. The party that was supposed to be the culmination of my revenge brought me no relief. All I saw was broken relationships and bitterness. When everyone left, I was alone in the living room. Emily was sitting on the couch, her face wet with tears. She tried to say something, but I held up my hand, stopping her. Not today, Emily. I'm too tired of the lies. I grabbed my jacket and walked out of the house. The night air was cold, but it felt like the only thing I could feel right now. My phone vibrated. It was Rachel. Thanks again. If you need any help, just let me know. I looked at the screen but didn't answer. I needed time now to process everything that had happened. It had been a week since that unfortunate party. The house that had once seemed like a cozy refuge to me was now filled with a dark silence and a heavy atmosphere. Emily still lived here, though I couldn't look at her anymore. We hardly spoke at all, just exchanged short phrases when absolutely necessary. I felt as if my world had collapsed. The work that used to bring me satisfaction now seemed meaningless. Colleagues noticed that something was wrong with me, but no one dared to ask. Every evening I left the house under any pretext, a walk, meeting with friends, even just a ride in the car without a purpose. Anything to avoid her. One night, coming home later than usual, I found Emily in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, a nearly empty glass of wine in front of her. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and her hair disheveled. We need to talk, John, she said as I walked past. I stopped without turning my head. About what, Emily? About how you destroyed everything we'd built, she sighed, her voice weak. I know what I did. I know I betrayed you. But it was a mistake, John. Things got out of control. I turned around, looking at her in disbelief. You call it a mistake? The correspondence, the meetings behind my back, the lies, it's all a mistake. She covered her face with her hands. I'm not making excuses for myself. But I want you to hear me. It was a moment of weakness, a moment. I interrupted her, unable to hold back the sarcasm. It was a hell of a moment, Emily. Her words sounded like a pathetic excuse, but I saw more than that in her eyes. It wasn't just remorse, but fear. Fear of losing what was left of our marriage. John, her voice trembled, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know it's impossible. But I want to try to make things right. I was silent, digesting her words. In the back of my mind, I knew that part of me still clung to the past, to the Emily I loved. But was it worth giving her a second chance? Do you want to fix it? I finally asked. Then start with the truth. Tell me everything. Emily froze, her eyes filling with tears. She realized that everything depended on this conversation. She began to speak, and every word she spoke was like a knife in her heart. She talked about how she met Mark, how it all started with innocent conversations that soon turned into something more. She talked about the feelings she had for him, how she tried to find in him what she said was missing in our marriage. I'm not trying to make excuses, she said finally. But I want you to know that I never meant for it to go this far. I listened to her silently, gritting my teeth. A hurricane of anger, pain, and confusion raged inside me. After her confession, I left the house and went to a bar. I needed to talk to someone who could understand. I called my friend Mike, who has always been there for me in times of need. John, you have to decide what you need to do, he said when I told him everything. Forgive her and try to make things right, or put it behind you and move on. His words sounded logical, but I couldn't find an answer to that question. The days were getting harder and harder. Every morning when I woke up, I struggled to force myself out of bed. The house that had once been a place of love and comfort now seemed like a cage with no way out. Emily and I continued to exist side by side, but there was no intimacy between us. We were like two different people living in the same space, unwilling or unable to touch each other. I began to think often about what might have been if we hadn't gotten to this point. Emily, who had once been everything to me, now seemed like a stranger. She tried to mend the relationship, tried to talk, but I was too consumed with my own internal conflict to take her seriously. I began to walk the streets of the city often, seeking solitude in the noise of human streams. On the street I felt alive, but as soon as I returned home, I was once again overcome by a sense of loneliness. Sometimes I would sit in my chair and look at the pictures of Emily and I taken before this whole nightmare. Those moments of happiness seemed so distant and unreal now. I came home late one night. Emily was already in her room, sitting on the edge of the bed, as if waiting for me. When I came in, she looked up, her face the same fear I'd seen in her eyes the week before. You've changed something, John, she said quietly, almost sadly. You're different. You're nothing like you used to be. I remained silent, knowing her words were true. I felt something inside me break. This rift she had created was too big to mend. Can't be the same, I finally answered, as if the words had come out of my mouth. You killed what was between us. Emily didn't answer right away. She looked like she was torn between wanting to fight for us and realizing that maybe all was lost. But I love you, John, she whispered. This wasn't about you. I don't want to lose you. Her words didn't warm me, on the contrary, they only pushed me toward a sense of hopelessness. I felt that there was no real feeling behind the words, that she was saying it because she didn't want to be alone and not because she really wanted to repair our relationship. I realized that none of her attempts could bring back what we had before. Every meeting with her, every word she said only deepened the chasm. She was really trying, but she didn't realize that her betrayal was the very moment when something broke. Maybe she didn't see it, but for me, it wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was a choice. And I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. At some point, I realized that I could no longer continue to live with her under these circumstances. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't anger, it was a deep disappointment in what I had put into the relationship and what I had gotten in return. The next morning, when I woke up, I made a decision. I could no longer stay in this house. In this atmosphere that kept me from breathing. I had to do something to change my life. I knew that if I didn't take that step now, I would remain a prisoner of this situation forever. I couldn't look at Emily anymore, hoping for something better. I knew that the time I had lost in trying to rebuild the relationship was already gone. And now I had to take a step toward liberation. I gathered the few things that really mattered to me and left the rest behind. Emily was still asleep, her face peaceful, but I knew that when she woke up, she would find me gone. Leaving the house, I felt strangely relieved, but also bitter at the same time. There were a lot of good memories in that house. A lot of love, but there was also the betrayal that had ruined everything. I closed the door behind me and got into the car. That night I didn't know where I was going, I just wanted to get away from it all. I tried to find answers to my questions, but in that emptiness, in that uncertainty, I realized one thing: everything was in my hands now. Emily was no longer in control of my life. I sat behind the wheel, feeling every kilometer I drove separating me from Emily and what had once been our life. Everything was mixing in my head: frustration, anger, loneliness. With each moment, I realized that by leaving, I wasn't just saving myself, I was destroying everything that was left between us. But I also realized that it was the only way to move forward. Driving through the streets, I stopped at a bridge where the river flowed quietly beneath me. It was one of those places I often went when I needed to think, to feel alone with myself. Places that were associated with those times when everything seemed simple and clear. But now this place was a complete contrast. All decisions seemed agonizing and uncertain. I sat in silence until memories of the beginning of my relationship with Emily began to surface in my mind. Everything seemed so alive, so full of hopes and dreams. We dated for a long time, making plans for the future. I truly believed that our marriage was strong, but here's what happened. I couldn't believe that she could betray me so easily. That realization was burning me from the inside out. The next day I was back in town, but not in the house. My footsteps led me to a coffee shop where I met Mike, my friend. He knew I was going through a difficult time, and was probably the only person I could truly open up with. "You did the right thing to leave," he said, after I'd told him everything. "But you have to realize that the decision you made won't take away your pain. It will just be a new phase." I nodded, but I wasn't really ready to accept everything that was happening yet. Mike went on to talk about the importance of self-discovery, of forgiving yourself before thinking about how to forgive others. "I wasn't sure I could do that. You don't want to stay in that tyranny, trapped memory," Mike continued. "You can survive it, but only if you put the past behind you." His words gave me a chance to really think about what I was feeling. Perhaps one thing I needed to realize in order to move on was that I couldn't change what had happened, but I could choose how to react to it. I could give myself a chance at a new beginning. A couple days later, I decided to meet with Emily. We both knew what we needed to say to each other. I arrived at our house, stood in front of the door, and in that moment my heart was beating in my chest with double the force. I didn't know what was in store for me, but I knew one thing: would not return to this house the same person. Emily sat in the kitchen, her face a tired expression and her eyes dull with tears. She didn't say a word when I walked in. I was the one who should have started the conversation, but in that moment I realized that she was probably waiting for my decision, for what I would say to her. "Emily," I said quietly, "I can't be with you, I can't continue this marriage. Everything you've done has destroyed what I believed in." She looked up, but instead of making excuses, she just stared at me in silence. Maybe she was already realizing that anything she could say wouldn't change what we'd both been through. "I don't forgive you," I continued. "I don't know if I ever will, but right now I need to leave. We need to stop this." Emily shook her head, her lips trembling, but she remained silent. There was bitterness in her eyes. Regret, but for a moment it was clear to me: she knew we'd both lost something important and we couldn't get it back. We were strangers to each other, and trying to rebuild the trust we had lost was no longer worthwhile. I left the house that night, not knowing what awaited me. I felt pain, but at the same time, I felt myself leaving everything behind with each step. It may not have been the end of my journey, but it was a step towards a new beginning. I started working on myself. I exercised, spent a lot of time with friends, and soon met other people who helped me realize that life doesn't end with one person. Gradually I was freed from resentment and pain. With each passing day, I realized that losing Emily was not the end for me. I learned to let go. She and I weren't the people we wanted to be for each other. But maybe that was what it took to find my true path. No one knows what will happen next. But one thing has become clear to me: there are always choices in life, and we don't have to stay in the past if it's dragging us down. It's time to move on. It's been a few months since I left Emily and began my healing journey. These months have been full of reflection, but also full of new discoveries. I've been trying to find new meaning, to learn to enjoy life anew despite everything that has happened. It was a long and difficult process, but I felt myself growing stronger. Sometimes I felt like life was giving me a chance again. I started visiting old places, socializing with people I hadn't seen in years. But deep down, I still couldn't forget what had happened. Sometimes when I closed my eyes, I would see her face, hear her voice. Those memories rose up again and again like ghosts of the past, but I tried not to let them control me. One day, almost 6 months after Emily and I had broken up, I found myself at a party organized by an old friend. It was a random choice, but at some point I realized that I was drawn not only by the interest in the event itself, but also by the fact that I could see old acquaintances, including her. I didn't know why I decided to go to this meeting. Maybe I just wanted to sort myself out and forget. When I got to the party, the atmosphere was light and casual, people were laughing, talking, enjoying the music. I wasn't the center of attention, but that was okay. I liked feeling part of something that wasn't about my personal tragedy. Then one day, as I sat in my office, I got a call from my sister. She informed me that Emily wanted to meet again. It was an unexpected turn, and I didn't know how to react. Our whole history seemed so distant and foreign to me. We hadn't spoken in a long time, and I thought she had already left me in the past. What did she say? I asked, trying to control my emotions. She said she wanted to talk. Not about you, but about you. She wants you to understand how she was feeling, why things happened the way they did. My feelings were mixed. I was both curious and wary. In the end, I agreed to meet with her. But on my own terms. I knew I had to be ready for anything, and that this meeting wouldn't change anything. Meeting Emily, when I saw her again, I felt everything inside me turn upside down. Emily sat in front of me, unchanged in appearance, but her eyes spoke of something more. She was quiet, but I could see that something had changed in her. Everything I once felt for her was now covered by the shroud of time. I'm not apologizing for everything, she said, but her voice was quiet and vulnerable. I just want you to know that I wasn't thinking about how much it would hurt you. I didn't realize what I was losing until I lost you. I remained silent. I wasn't ready to forgive her, but I couldn't and didn't want to be the kind of person who would hold a grudge. Emily was a part of my past. But I didn't want her presence to fill my life again. I looked at her, and instead of resentment, I felt relief. I hear you, Emily, I said. But we're not the same people we used to be. It's all in the past. She nodded and seemed to accept my decision. In her eyes I saw a shadow of regret, but also understanding. We both knew our paths had parted. After meeting Emily, I returned home with mixed feelings. Everything she said seemed like empty words, some vague apology. But I knew it was important to me, not to her, but to me. It was the last step to finally forgiving her, to letting her go, letting go of the past, and embracing a new chapter in my life. I started spending more time with friends, focusing on work, a project that was part of my new path. It became my main goal to focus on myself, not my old mistakes. I felt like I was finally finding the balance I had long sought. However, even despite my best efforts, the past continued to haunt me. Sometimes I thought I could hear her voice again, her words, hear the smell of what we had bonded over. I realized that I couldn't just forget everything that had happened, but I could only try to make it a part of my story. Not the center of it. One day I met someone new, someone who made me look at life from a different angle. It was Jenny, a humble, intelligent girl who worked for a neighboring company. We started talking in the mornings, eating lunch together, and soon it turned into something more. I felt a place in my heart start to make room for something new. Jenny was completely different. She didn't remind me of the past. She was sincere, open, and most importantly, she let me be myself. In her eyes I didn't see expectations or demands, just understanding and sincerity. She helped me look at life from a new perspective, not linking my past to my future, but just giving me a chance to start with a clean slate. At some point, I realized that I was no longer afraid of being vulnerable because Jenny didn't use my vulnerability against me. Instead, she was accepting me for who I was, along with my mistakes and my experiences. We began to build a relationship based on trust and respect, and I realized I had found what I was looking for: true love and support.